The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benson, a sprawling Army base in rural Virginia where tradition ran deeper than the Potomac River. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb stood in the parking lot outside the base gym, chest puffed out like a rooster in a henhouse. He'd been telling the same story for the past 20 minutes to anyone who'd listen. "I'm telling you, Navy SEALs are the real deal," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the asphalt. "Army Special Forces, please. We do the heavy lifting while they polish their green berets." Marcus had arrived at Fort Benson just 3 weeks ago, fresh from a stateside Navy assignment that had kept him behind a desk for most of his career. But you wouldn't know it from the way he talked. According to him, he'd single-handedly won the war on terror. "The problem with the Army," Marcus continued, jabbing his finger in the air, "is they let just about anyone in these days. Standards have gone straight downhill." A few younger soldiers lingered nearby, unsure whether to believe him or walk away. Marcus had been a Navy recruit instructor for years, and he knew how to command attention, even if he'd never actually seen combat. What Marcus didn't notice was the woman approaching from behind, her boots making barely a whisper on the pavement. Captain Elena Vasquez had just finished a 10-mile run, her Army PT shirt dark with sweat. At 42, she kept herself in better shape than soldiers half her age. She had to. When you're a woman in Special Forces, you don't get the luxury of being average. Elena had been listening to Marcus for the past 5 minutes, her jaw tightening with each word. She'd planned to walk past him, to let it go like she'd let 1,000 other comments go over her 20-year career. But when he started talking about lowered standards, something inside her snapped. "Excuse me, Sergeant," Elena said, her voice calm but firm. Marcus turned around, his eyes traveling from her captain's rank to her Special Forces tab, then back to her face. A slow smirk spread across his features. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The word ma'am dripped with condescension. "I couldn't help but overhear your speech about Navy SEALs," Elena said. "Impressive credentials. How many combat deployments have you completed?" Marcus's smirk faltered for just a second. "That's classified information, Captain." "Of course it is," Elena replied, her tone suggesting she knew exactly what that meant. "And your SEAL team number, which one were you with?" The younger soldiers had stopped pretending not to listen. They formed a loose semicircle, sensing something interesting was about to happen. Marcus's face reddened. "Look, I don't have to explain my service record to you. I was making a point about standards and training quality." "You were making a point about something you clearly don't understand," Elena interrupted. "While you're busy telling war stories in parking lots, some of us have actual work to do." "Typical Army attitude," Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "Can't handle a little criticism, so you get defensive. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The Navy trains warriors. The Army trains." He paused, looking Elena up and down with undisguised disdain. "Well, whatever this is supposed to be." The air seemed to freeze. The young soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew you didn't talk to a captain that way, especially not when she wore the Special Forces tab that Marcus himself lacked. Elena took a step closer. She wasn't tall, 5'6" at most, but something in her presence made Marcus instinctively step back. "Sergeant Webb," she said quietly, "I'm going to give you a piece of advice, free of charge. When you're new to a base, it's usually smart to figure out who you're talking about before you run your mouth." "Is that a threat, ma'am?" Marcus's voice dripped with sarcasm. "No, Sergeant, it's a courtesy." Elena turned to walk away, then stopped. "Oh, and Sergeant, the gym has a board listing all the base records for PT tests, obstacle courses, and marksmanship. You might want to take a look before you make any more comments about Army standards." She walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the parking lot, his audience now looking at him with questions in their eyes instead of admiration. Marcus watched her go, anger bubbling in his chest. Who did she think she was? He was a Navy man. Navy SEALs were the elite of the elite. This woman, this Army captain, had just embarrassed him in front of junior enlisted soldiers. That couldn't stand. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the base gym at 0500 hours, determined to make a statement. He'd spent the previous evening stewing over his encounter with Captain Vasquez, and he decided the best way to put her in her place was to dominate the physical training arena. After all, he'd been a recruit instructor. He knew how to run an obstacle course. The gym was mostly empty at this early hour, just a handful of dedicated soldiers getting their workouts in before the day began. Marcus made his way to the record board Alina had mentioned, curious despite himself. What he saw made his stomach drop. The obstacle course record, Captain E. Vasquez, 4 minutes 32 seconds. The women's PT test record for the 40-44 age group, Captain E. Vasquez, 598 out of 600 points. The expert marksmanship qualification, Captain E. Vasquez had shot a perfect score 3 months running. Marcus stared at the board, his mind working through the implications. These had to be mistakes, or maybe there were multiple people with the same name, or maybe the standards for women were just so much lower that. Looking for something, Sergeant. Marcus spun around. Alina stood behind him in her PT gear, a water bottle in one hand. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew exactly what he was thinking. Just familiarizing myself with the base, Marcus said stiffly. Good idea, Alina replied. She walked past him to a row of pull-up bars and began her warm-up routine. Marcus couldn't help but watch as she knocked out 20 pull-ups without apparent effort, her form textbook perfect. By the time she finished, a small crowd had gathered. Morning PT was a social time at Fort Benson, and word had spread about yesterday's parking lot confrontation. Sergeant Webb called out a young private named Torres. The sergeant major is looking for you, something about in processing paperwork. Marcus nodded curtly and left, but not before catching Alina's eye one more time. This wasn't over. Over the next few days, Marcus made it his personal mission to prove that Navy training was superior. He showed up to every PT session, made snide comments about Army fitness standards, and generally made himself into a nuisance that everyone noticed but no one had quite enough rank to shut down. On Thursday morning, he made his move. The base commander, Colonel Richardson, was hosting a demonstration for a visiting group of high school students considering military service. Different units were showcasing various skills, marksmanship, tactical drills, and physical fitness challenges. Marcus volunteered to run the obstacle course as a demonstration, and he made sure everyone knew he'd be setting a new record. He spent all morning stretching, hydrating, and talking about how Navy training had prepared him for exactly this kind of challenge. Watch and learn, he announced to the gathered students as he took his position at the starting line. This is what real military excellence looks like. He attacked the course with everything he had. The rope climb, the wall, the tire run, the monkey bars. He pushed through each obstacle with determination, his lungs burning and his muscles screaming. When he crossed the finish line, he bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. Time, called out the sergeant managing the stopwatch. 6 minutes, 18 seconds. Good run, Sergeant Webb. Marcus's head snapped up. What? That can't be right, check it again. 6 minutes, 18 seconds, the sergeant repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The students clapped politely, but Marcus could see the disappointment in some of their faces. 6 minutes wasn't bad, but it wasn't the record-breaking performance he'd promised. The course must be different from Navy standards, Marcus said loudly. Different equipment, different setup, not really a fair comparison. It's a standard obstacle course, Sergeant, Colonel Richardson said from the sidelines. The colonel was a lean man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Same specifications as every other Army base in the country. Well, I'd like to see someone from this base do better, Marcus said, his voice carrying a challenge. Colonel Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. Captain Vasquez, are you warmed up? Elena had been standing off to the side, watching the demonstration with the other officers. She looked at the colonel, then at Marcus, and Marcus could swear he saw the tiniest hint of a smile. Yes, sir, she said, ready when you are. Wait, Marcus said, suddenly realizing where this was going. This isn't necessary. You asked to see someone from this base do better, Colonel Richardson said mildly. Captain Vasquez holds the course record. Seems like a fair demonstration. Elena walked to the starting line. She didn't stretch or psych herself up. She just stood there, breathing evenly, waiting for the signal. On your mark, the sergeant called. Get set, go. What happened next would be talked about at Fort Benson for years to come. Elena exploded off the starting line like a sprinter, but what struck everyone watching wasn't her speed. It was her efficiency. Where Marcus had attacked the obstacles with brute force, Elena moved with a grace that made the difficult course look easy. The rope climb that had taken Marcus nearly 30 seconds, Elena scaled in 15, her technique flawless. She hit the 8-foot wall at a full run, caught the top edge with both hands, and pulled herself over in one smooth motion. The tire run, a nightmare of rubber obstacles that had to be navigated in a specific pattern. She danced through like she'd choreographed it herself. Marcus watched, his mouth hanging open. This wasn't possible. She was 42 years old and she was moving like an Olympic athlete. The monkey bars were where Marcus had lost the most time, his arms burning as he struggled across. Elena swung across them with a rhythm that seemed effortless, her core tight, her movements controlled. She dropped off the end and hit the cargo net without breaking stride. The high school students had stopped being polite. They were cheering now, caught up in the display of pure athleticism. Some of them had their phones out, recording. Elena cleared the final obstacle, a series of hurdles followed by a sprint to the finish, and crossed the line. She wasn't even breathing hard. Time, the sergeant called out, checking his stopwatch twice to be sure. 4 minutes, 28 seconds. That's a new base record, Captain. Congratulations. The students erupted in applause. Colonel Richardson was smiling, clearly pleased with the demonstration. Even the other officers were clapping. Elena accepted a water bottle from one of the soldiers and took a long drink. Then she walked over to where Marcus stood, still frozen in disbelief. Good effort out there, Sergeant, she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. 6 minutes 18 is respectable for someone who hasn't run a course in a while. It was a professional comment, maybe even kind, but to Marcus it felt like acid. You've obviously been training specifically for this course, he said, his voice tight. Knowing the obstacles in advance, practicing the route. Actually, interrupted Captain James Okonkwo, one of Elena's fellow Special Forces officers. Elena just got back from a 6-month deployment 2 weeks ago. This is the first time she's run this particular course in over a year. Marcus felt his face burning. Around him, he could sense the other soldiers' opinions shifting. He talked so much about Navy superiority, about standards and training, and now he'd been thoroughly outperformed by the very person he'd dismissed. The Navy doesn't focus on obstacle courses, he said, grasping for any explanation. We train for real-world combat situations. Is that so? Colonel Richardson approached, his expression thoughtful. Captain Vasquez, didn't you just return from Afghanistan? Yes, sir, Elena said. 6 months embedded with an Afghan Special Forces unit, training and conducting joint operations. And before that, 18 months at Fort Bragg as a senior instructor at the Special Forces qualification course, sir. Before that, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Syria. Colonel Richardson turned to Marcus. Sergeant Webb, what was your last assignment? Marcus's jaw clenched. Naval Recruit Training Command, Great Lakes, sir. 3 years as a recruit division commander. Important work, Richardson said neutrally. Training the next generation of sailors, but perhaps not the best basis for comparison when it comes to combat-oriented physical fitness. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had been an instructor, yes, but he'd been teaching teenagers how to make their beds and march in formation, not combat skills. "Permission to speak freely, sir," Marcus said, his voice strained. Richardson nodded. "With all due respect, I'm a Navy SEAL," Marcus said, and Alina noticed he'd dropped the past tense qualifier he'd been using before. "We're trained to a higher standard than any Army unit, Special Forces included. One obstacle course doesn't change that." The area went quiet. The high school students who'd been chattering excitedly fell silent. The other officers exchanged glances. Colonel Richardson's expression didn't change, but his voice took on an edge. "Sergeant Webb, are you currently assigned to a SEAL team?" "I completed SEAL training," Marcus said, and Alina heard the careful phrasing. "That's not what I asked." Marcus's face had gone from red to almost purple. "No, sir. I'm currently in a transitional assignment." "I see." Richardson turned to one of his aides. "Captain Chen, could you pull up Sergeant Webb's service record, please?" "That's not necessary, sir," Marcus said quickly. "I think it is," Richardson replied. "You've made some significant claims about your qualifications. If you're going to represent yourself as a Navy SEAL at my base, I'd like to verify that." 10 minutes later, they were in Richardson's office. The colonel behind his desk, Marcus standing at attention, Alina seated in one of the visitors' chairs at Richardson's request. Captain Chen had pulled up Marcus's record on the colonel's computer. Richardson read it in silence, his expression growing colder with each passing second. "Sergeant Webb," he finally said, "according to this, you did attend basic underwater demolition SEAL training 12 years ago." "Yes, sir," Marcus said, a hint of triumph in his voice. "You washed out in week 3. The silence in Colonel Richardson's office was absolute. Marcus stood frozen at attention, his face cycling through emotions: shock, humiliation, anger, and finally, a desperate kind of defiance. "I was injured, sir," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A training injury that would have healed, but they medically dropped me from the course. It wasn't my fault." Richardson scrolled through the record. "According to this, you sustained a minor ankle sprain during the 2nd week and were given time to recover. You were dropped from training in week 3 for failing to meet minimum performance standards during a timed swim." Marcus said nothing. "After that," Richardson continued, "you were reassigned to recruit training where you spent the next decade. A respectable career, Sergeant, but not the one you've been claiming." Alina sat quietly watching Marcus. She felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, certainly, but also a strange kind of pity. She knew what it was like to fall short of a dream. The difference was she'd never lied about it. "Sergeant Webb," Richardson said, his tone formal now, "stolen valor is a serious offense. You've been representing yourself as a Navy SEAL when you failed SEAL training and never served in that capacity." "I never said I was currently a SEAL," Marcus protested. "I just said I went through SEAL training." "I'm a Navy SEAL," Alina said softly. "That's what you said in the parking lot, present tense, and you've been implying active SEAL status in every conversation you've had on this base." Marcus's eyes snapped to her, full of venom. "This is your fault. You couldn't just let it go. You had to make this into a competition." "I asked you a simple question about your deployments," Alina said, her voice calm. "You're the one who decided to turn it into something more." Colonel Richardson stood up. "Sergeant Webb, you're dismissed. Report to the base legal office at 1300 hours. They'll advise you on the administrative actions we'll be taking. You're also restricted to base until this is resolved." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He saluted sharply, turned on his heel and left the office, closing the door perhaps a bit harder than necessary. Richardson sat back down with a sigh. "I apologize, Captain Vasquez. I should have caught this during his in-processing." "Not your fault, sir," Elena said. "He's not the first person to exaggerate his service record, and he won't be the last." "No," Richardson agreed, "but he chose the wrong person to belittle." He looked at Elena with something like amusement. "You could have told him who you were from the start." Elena smiled slightly. "Where's the fun in that, sir?" Richardson chuckled, then grew more serious. "How are you doing, Elena? Really, I know the last deployment was rough." Elena's smile faded. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "It was difficult, sir. We lost good people, but that's the job." "It is," Richardson said, "but that doesn't make it easy. The counseling services are available if you need them." "I know, sir, thank you." Elena left the colonel's office and walked across the base, her mind wandering back to Afghanistan. The heat, the dust, the constant threat of attack. The faces of the Afghan soldiers she'd trained, some of whom hadn't made it home. The weight of command, of making decisions that meant life or death. And then she thought about Marcus Webb, a man so insecure about his own failures that he'd built an entire false identity to hide them. She found herself at the base chapel, a small white building that sat at the edge of the main compound. Elena wasn't particularly religious, but she often came here when she needed to think. It was quiet, peaceful. She sat in one of the pews and closed her eyes. Elena had grown up in San Antonio, Texas, the daughter of a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. She joined the army at 18 because she needed purpose, structure, something bigger than herself. She'd never planned on making it a career, let alone becoming one of the first women to complete the Special Forces qualification course. That journey had been hell. Physical hell, mental hell, emotional hell. The instructors hadn't gone easy on her because she was a woman. If anything, they'd been harder on her, testing to see if she'd break. Some of them had wanted her to fail, had believed women didn't belong in special forces. But Elena had a gift for quiet determination. When others quit, she kept going. When others complained, she adapted. When others made excuses, she found solutions. She'd made it through the Q course, earned her Green Beret, and deployed to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She'd led soldiers in combat, saved lives, taken lives when necessary. She'd earned every bit of respect she'd received, one hard day at a time. And then people like Marcus Webb came along, demanding respect they hadn't earned, claiming achievements they'd never accomplished. It made her tired. The chapel door opened, and Elena turned to see Captain Okonkwo walking in. James had been her teammate on her last deployment, a solid officer and a good friend. "Figured I'd find you here," he said, sliding into the pew beside her. "Word travels fast," Elena observed. "Base this size, word travels at light speed." James was quiet for a moment. "How you feeling about all this?" "Honestly, I'm not sure," Elena said. "Part of me feels bad for the guy. He clearly has some issues. And the other part? The other part is angry that I have to deal with this nonsense after 20 years of proving myself over and over again." James nodded. "You know what the junior enlisted are saying. They're calling you the Silent Storm." Elena raised an eyebrow. "That's dramatic." "It fits, though," James said. "You don't make noise, you don't brag, you just quietly outperform everyone around you. And when someone like Webb pushes you, you don't explode. You just prove them wrong so thoroughly that there's nothing left to say." Elena smiled despite herself. "I just ran an obstacle course, James." "You did more than that, and you know it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. "What do you think will happen to him?" Elena finally asked. "Webb, probably a letter of reprimand, maybe reduction in rank if they pursue the stolen valor angle seriously. Definitely a permanent black mark on his record. His career is over, Alina said quietly. He did that to himself, James pointed out. You didn't make him lie about being a SEAL. You didn't make him trash-talk everyone at his new base. He made those choices. I know, Alina said, but still. You're too good a person, Alina, James said, standing up. But that's why people respect you. Come on, I'll buy you lunch. You just set a base record that deserves celebrating. Alina followed him out of the chapel, but her thoughts stayed on Marcus Webb. She had a feeling this wasn't quite over yet. 3 days later, Alina was called back to Colonel Richardson's office. When she arrived, she found not just the colonel, but also the base sergeant major and a Navy commander she didn't recognize. Captain Vasquez, Richardson said, this is Commander Patricia Hernandez from Naval Personnel Command. She's here about Sergeant Webb. Alina shook the commander's hand, trying to read the room. Everyone looked serious but not hostile. Captain, Commander Hernandez began, I wanted to speak with you personally about the situation with Sergeant Webb. First, I want to apologize on behalf of the Navy. His behavior was unprofessional, and his misrepresentation of his service record is unacceptable. I appreciate that, ma'am, Alina said carefully. We've completed our investigation, Hernandez continued. Sergeant Webb did attend Bud-S training as he claimed, but he was dropped for performance issues, not injury as he's been telling people. After that, he spent his career in recruit training, and by all accounts he was a competent instructor. But somewhere along the way he started embellishing his story. It happens, Alina said diplomatically. More than it should, Hernandez agreed. But here's the thing, Captain. In the course of our investigation, we discovered that Sergeant Webb has been making these claims for years. He's told people at multiple commands that he was an active SEAL. He's even worn SEAL insignia at non-military events. Alina winced. That was serious. We'll be pursuing administrative action, Hernandez said. But he's also requested to speak with you directly. Alina's eyebrows rose. Me? Why? He says he wants to apologize, the sergeant major said, speaking for the first time. Personally, I think he's hoping you'll put in a good word for him, maybe soften the consequences. Will you meet with him? Richardson asked. You're under no obligation. Alina considered. Her first instinct was to refuse. What did she owe Marcus Webb? But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same impulse that had made her feel sorry for him in the chapel. I'll meet with him, she said, but only if you're all present. I want witnesses. They brought Marcus in 15 minutes later. He looked terrible, unshaven, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw Alina, something complicated crossed his face. Captain Vasquez, he said, his voice hoarse, thank you for agreeing to see me. Alina nodded but said nothing. Marcus took a deep breath. I want to apologize for everything I said, everything I implied. You didn't deserve any of that. No, Alina agreed, I didn't. Marcus flinched at the bluntness, but continued. I've spent the last few days thinking about how I got here, and the truth is, I've been lying to myself for so long that I started to believe my own stories. Why? Alina asked. You had a respectable career as an instructor. Why wasn't that enough? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because I failed, he finally said. Failing Bud-S was the worst moment of my life. I wanted to be a SEAL so badly and I just couldn't make it. And watching everyone else succeed while I washed out, it destroyed something in me. So you pretended you hadn't failed, Alina said. At first, I just didn't correct people when they made assumptions. Then I started leaving out details. Then I started actively lying. And before I knew it, the lie had become my identity. Marcus looked directly at Alina. When I saw you, a woman, an army officer, excelling at everything I'd claimed to be good at, it made me angry. Not at you, at myself, at my own inadequacy. And you took it out on me, Alina said. Yes, Marcus admitted. I did, and I'm sorry. Alina studied him, trying to decide if this was genuine or just another manipulation. But the misery in his eyes looked real. Sergeant Webb, she said slowly, I accept your apology, but accepting your apology doesn't mean what you did was okay. I know. You didn't just insult me. You insulted every woman who's served, every soldier who's earned their place through hard work. You claimed honor you didn't earn, and that's one of the worst things a service member can do. Marcus nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Elena turned to Commander Hernandez. What happens now? Sergeant Webb will be receiving an administrative discharge, Hernandez said. Other than honorable conditions, he'll lose most of his benefits and will not be eligible for re-enlistment. Marcus's head dropped. Elena watched him, feeling that complicated mix of emotions again, justice served. But also the tragedy of watching someone destroy their own life. Commander, Elena said carefully, may I make a suggestion? Hernandez looked surprised. Of course, Captain. Sergeant Webb was a good instructor according to his records. He helped train thousands of sailors over the years. That was real service, real contribution. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. What he did with the stolen valor was wrong, absolutely. But maybe there's a way to handle this that acknowledges both his legitimate service and his serious mistakes. Richardson leaned forward. What are you proposing? A general discharge instead of OTH, Elena said. Still not honorable, still a permanent mark on his record, but not quite as devastating. He'd keep some benefits, have a better chance at civilian employment. But in exchange, he has to do something for the military community. Like what? Hernandez asked, genuinely curious. He speaks at military events about the dangers of stolen valor. He shares his story, the real story, as a cautionary tale. He owns what he did and uses it to educate others. The room was silent. Marcus had looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. That's, Commander Hernandez paused, thinking. Actually, that might have real value. We have an ongoing problem with false valor claims. Someone who's actually lived it, who can speak authentically about why it happens and why it's wrong. It could make a difference, Richardson finished. Why would you do that for me? Marcus asked Elena, his voice breaking. After everything I said about you. Elena stood up. Because I've seen what happens when people define themselves by their worst moments. You failed Bud S. Sergeant Webb. That doesn't make you a failure as a person. You had a good career as an instructor. You helped people. And then you made some very bad choices. She walked over to where he sat. You can either let those bad choices define you forever, or you can own them, learn from them, and use them to help others. That's your call. Marcus looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he whispered. Elena nodded and turned to leave, but Richardson stopped her. Captain Vasquez, he said, one more thing. I wanted you to know that your actions over the past few days, your professionalism, your composure, your grace under pressure, have not gone unnoticed. I'm recommending you for promotion to major and for a position at the Army War College as a senior instructor. Elena's breath caught. The War College was one of the most prestigious assignments in the Army. Sir, I thank you, sir. You've earned it, Richardson said simply. Dismissed. Elena walked out of the office and into the bright Virginia sunshine. She felt lighter somehow, like a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally lifted. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Heard the news about War College. Drinks tonight to celebrate. Elena smiled and texted back, absolutely. As she walked across the base toward her quarters, she passed the gym where this had all started. The record board was still there, her name at the top of several categories. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that she'd shown up, done the work, and let her actions speak louder than anyone's words. That evening, at a small bar just off base, Elena raised a glass with James, and several other officers who'd become friends over the years. To the silent storm, James said, grinning. To doing the work, Elena countered. To proving people wrong without saying a word, added Captain Chen, who'd become something of an admirer after watching Elena handle the situation with Webb. They clinked glasses, and Elena smiled. Tomorrow she'd start preparing for the War College position. Tomorrow she'd continue the work she'd been doing for 20 years. But tonight she'd celebrate not just her victory over Marcus Webb, but something bigger, the knowledge that character, competence, and quiet dignity would always, eventually, win out over empty boasts and false claims. 3 months later, Elena received a letter. It was from Marcus Webb. He'd been discharged from the Navy, but as they'd agreed, with a general discharge rather than OTH. He'd started speaking at veterans' events about stolen valor, sharing his story honestly and without excuses. The letter was short. Captain Vasquez, I wanted to thank you again for giving me a chance to redeem something from my mistakes. I've given 4 speeches now, and every time I tell the truth about what I did and why, it gets a little easier. People don't like me much afterward, but they listen. Some have told me it made them think twice about exaggerating their own service. I'm working as a civilian contractor now, teaching basic leadership skills. It's humbling work, but it's honest. I'm trying to be honest now in everything. I'll never be a Navy SEAL. I'm finally okay with that. I was a Navy recruit instructor and I was good at it. That's enough. Thank you for teaching me that. Respectfully, Marcus Webb. Elena filed the letter away and returned to her work. She had a class to teach in an hour, young officers who wanted to earn their way into special forces. She'd tell them the truth. It would be harder than they imagined, more painful than they could anticipate, and absolutely worth it.